A quiet woman inherits an old cabin her family laughed at, convinced it was worthless and forgotten. But when she steps inside the old cabin and uncovers what's hidden beneath it, everything changes. What she finds isn't just a secret, it's a legacy powerful enough to transform her life forever. Subscribe for more powerful stories and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The morning of the will reading carried a quiet chill through the mountain town of Aspen Hollow, the kind that settles deep in your bones and lingers longer than it should. Clara Whitmore stood just outside the old chapel, her gloved hands wrapped around a paper cup of coffee that had long gone cold. She hadn't come back here in years, not since life had slowly pulled her away, piece by piece. Inside, her relatives gathered in small circles, their voices low but sharp, like whispers that carried judgment instead of grief. Some glanced her way, then quickly looked off, as if acknowledging her would mean admitting she still belonged. Clara had always been the quiet one, the one who didn't chase money, didn't argue, didn't demand attention. To them, that meant she had nothing. Her grandmother, Margaret Hale, had been different. Strong, observant, the kind of woman who didn't waste words. But when she spoke, people listened. Clara remembered sitting beside her as a child on the creaky porch of a forgotten cabin deep in the woods, the smell of pine, the warmth of a lantern, the sound of stories that felt too important to forget. Now that woman was gone, and whatever she had left behind was waiting to be revealed. Clara took a slow breath, straightened her coat, and stepped inside, unaware that by the end of the day, everything people believed about her would begin to unravel. The room felt smaller once everyone had taken their seats. It wasn't just the walls of the old law office on Main Street. It was the way the air seemed to tighten, as if every breath carried expectation. Clara Whitmore sat near the far end of the long oak table, her hands folded quietly in her lap, her posture straight but unassuming. She didn't look around much. She didn't need to. She could feel them. Her cousins shifting in their chairs, her aunt whispering behind a polite smile, the occasional glance in her direction, quick, calculating, and then gone again. They weren't here just to remember Margaret Hale. They were here for what she left behind. At the head of the table, Mr. Whitaker adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat, the soft rustle of paper cutting through the silence. He had the kind of voice that didn't rush, didn't stumble. Every word landed exactly where it was meant to. The last will and testament of Margaret Hale. The words began to unfold like a slow-moving current. At first, it was exactly what everyone expected. Shares of land, savings accounts, jewelry passed down through generations. Each name called was followed by a subtle shift in posture, a straightening of shoulders, a quiet exhale, the faintest hint of satisfaction carefully hidden behind polite expressions. Clara listened, but her mind drifted. Not to the numbers, not to the possessions, but to her grandmother's hands, worn but steady, guiding hers as they repaired an old lantern on the cabin porch. To the way Margaret would pause before speaking, as if weighing not just what to say, but whether it needed to be said at all. Clara had never once asked her for anything, and somehow that felt important now. To my niece, Vivian Hale, the property on Willow Creek. To my grandson, Daniel Hale, the investment accounts totaling. A soft murmur of approval moved through the room like a ripple. Clara remained still. She wasn't expecting her name. Not really. And maybe that's why, when it finally came, it didn't feel real at first. There was a pause. Not long, but long enough. Mr. Whitaker glanced down at the page, then back up briefly, his eyes settling just for a moment on Clara. Then he read, "To my granddaughter, Clara Whitmore. I leave the cabin located beyond Pine Ridge, along with the land it rests on, and everything contained within." Silence. Then, a quiet laugh. Not loud, not cruel in tone, but unmistakable. Someone shifted in their seat. Another voice, barely above a whisper, muttered, "That old place?" A second chuckle followed, quickly stifled but impossible to ignore. Clara didn't turn her head. She didn't need to see their expressions. She already knew them. The cabin. To them, it was nothing. An aging structure buried deep in the woods, too far from town, too worn to sell for anything worthwhile, a place long forgotten except as a passing memory. To them, it was a burden. To Clara, it was something else entirely, but she kept that to herself. Mr. Whitaker continued, his voice steady as if the reaction in the room hadn't happened at all. The rest of the will was concluded quickly. Signatures acknowledged, formalities completed. Chairs began to scrape softly against the wooden floor. Conversations shifted, no longer hushed, no longer careful. Plans? Numbers. What they would do with what they had received. Clara stood slowly, smoothing the sleeve of her coat. No one approached her. Not really. One cousin gave a polite nod, the kind reserved for distant acquaintances. Another avoided her entirely, already engaged in a conversation about renovations and resale values. She stepped outside into the late afternoon light. The sun hung low, casting long shadows across the quiet street. The air was cooler now, the kind that hinted at evening settling in. For a moment, she just stood there, listening. To the distant hum of a passing car, to the faint rustle of leaves, to the silence that followed her out of that room. They had laughed, not loudly, but enough to make their meaning clear. Clara exhaled slowly, her breath visible in the cooling air. Then, almost without realizing it, she smiled. Not because she found it amusing, but because something deep inside her, something steady, something certain had begun to take shape. Her grandmother had never done anything without reason. Not once. Not in all the years Clara had known her. That cabin, it wasn't a mistake. It wasn't an afterthought. It was a choice. A deliberate one. Clara walked toward her car, the gravel crunching softly beneath her boots. She placed her hand on the door handle, then paused, her gaze drifting toward the distant line of mountains just visible beyond the town. Somewhere out there, beyond Pine Ridge, stood that cabin. Waiting. The others could keep their money, their polished houses, their easy answers. Clara felt something else stirring now. Not disappointment, not even curiosity. Something quieter, stronger. A pull. The kind you don't question, because it doesn't come from your mind. It comes from somewhere deeper. She opened the car door, slid into the driver's seat, and rested her hands on the wheel for a moment before starting the engine. She didn't know exactly what she would find out there, but she knew this much. Whatever her grandmother had left her, it was never going to be as simple as it seemed. And for the first time that day, Clara was ready to find out why. Clara didn't wait long. By the next morning, she was already on the road. The town of Aspen Hollow faded behind her in the rearview mirror, its neat streets and familiar faces shrinking into something distant, something quieter. The further she drove, the narrower the road became, until pavement gave way to gravel, and gravel to a winding dirt path that cut through the heart of Pine Ridge. Tall pines rose on either side, their branches swaying gently, whispering in a language only the forest seemed to understand. It felt untouched, like time had forgotten this place. When she finally saw the cabin, it didn't surprise her. Not really. It stood exactly as she remembered weathered wood, a slightly sagging porch, windows clouded with age. It wasn't impressive, it wasn't grand, but it felt honest. Clara stepped out of the car, the cool air brushing against her face, carrying the scent of pine and earth. For a moment, she just stood there, listening. No voices, no judgment, just the quiet. She walked up the creaking steps, each one groaning softly beneath her weight, as if recognizing her after all these years. Her hand rested on the door for a second before she pushed it open. The hinges protested. Inside, the air was still. Dust hung in thin beams of light that slipped through the narrow windows. The furniture was simple solid wood, worn but cared for. A table, a few chairs, a stone fireplace that still held the faint scent of old smoke. It hadn't been abandoned. It had been preserved. Clara moved slowly, her fingers brushing lightly over surfaces as she walked. Every corner of the cabin carried a memory, not loud, not overwhelming. Just present. She found herself standing by the fireplace, her eyes drifting to the mantel. Photographs. Faded, but familiar. Her grandmother as a young woman. A group of men building something, maybe this very cabin, and one photo that made her pause. A younger version of herself, sitting beside Margaret, holding a hammer far too big for her small hands. Clara swallowed. The room felt warmer suddenly. Heavier. She turned away, exhaling softly, and began to settle in. She opened windows, let fresh air move through the space, wiped down the table, and by evening, she had a small fire going in the hearth. The flames crackled gently, casting shadows that danced along the wooden walls. For the first time in a long while, she felt at peace, but it didn't last. It was subtle. The kind of thing most people would ignore. A detail too small to matter. Clara was sitting in one of the armchairs, her gaze drifting across the room, when something caught her attention. A rug? Old, faded, positioned in the far corner? But it wasn't lying flat. One edge sat just slightly uneven, like it had been moved and not quite put back the way it should have been. Clara frowned slightly. It was nothing. Probably. Still. She set her cup down and stood, her steps slow, almost hesitant, as she crossed the room. The fire behind her crackled softly, but the rest of the cabin had gone quiet again. Too quiet. She crouched beside the rug, running her hand along its surface. Dust lifted faintly into the air. Then, she felt it. A draft. Cool. Unmistakable. Coming from beneath. Her breath caught. Carefully, she lifted the corner of the rug. The fabric resisted at first, heavy with age, but then gave way, folding back to reveal something beneath. Wood, but not like the rest of the floor. These boards were tighter, cleaner, deliberate, and in the center, a small, tarnished metal ring. Clara stared at it. Her heart began to beat faster. This wasn't part of the cabin. This was hidden. For a long moment, she didn't move, as if touching it might make it disappear. Then slowly, she reached out. Her fingers wrapped around the cold metal. She pulled. At first, nothing. Then, a low creak. The wood shifted, and just like that, it opened. Darkness. Thick, absolute waiting. A breath of cool air rose from below, carrying a scent she couldn't quite place. Old wood, metal, something preserved. Clara leaned back slightly, her pulse echoing in her ears. "What were you hiding?" she whispered, barely audible. She stood quickly, moving with sudden purpose now, scanning the room until her eyes landed on her bag. She pulled out a flashlight, her hands just slightly unsteady. The beam cut through the darkness as she stepped back toward the opening. Wooden steps, narrow, leading down into something deeper than the cabin itself. Clara hesitated, just for a second. Then she placed her foot on the first step. It creaked, but held. One step, then another. The light moved ahead of her, pushing back the darkness inch by inch. The air grew cooler as she descended, the silence tightening around her, until her foot reached the bottom, and the light revealed the room. Clara froze. It wasn't empty. It wasn't abandoned. It was organized. Stone walls, carefully built, shelves lined with boxes, metal containers, objects that caught the light in dull, quiet glints. A table in the center, tools laid out as if someone had just stepped away. It didn't feel like a hiding place. It felt like a vault, a sanctuary. Clara took a slow step forward, her breath shallow now. Whatever this was, it wasn't just a secret. It was a life carefully stored beneath her feet, and in that moment, she understood. Her grandmother hadn't left her a broken cabin. She had left her a door. Clara didn't touch anything at first. She just stood there, in the middle of that hidden room, the beam of her flashlight stretching across the stone walls, catching on edges, glinting off surfaces that had no business being there. This wasn't what she expected. Not even close. She had imagined, if anything, dust, forgotten tools, maybe old boxes filled with things no one cared about anymore. But this was intentional. Every shelf was arranged, every object placed with care. There was no chaos here, no neglect. Even the air felt different, cool, dry, preserved, like the room itself had been built to protect something important. Clara took a slow step forward. Then another. Her boots echoed softly against the stone floor, each sound reminding her just how alone she was down here. And yet, somehow, she didn't feel alone at all. Her light drifted across a row of wooden boxes. She reached out, hesitating only briefly before opening one. Inside, coins. Dozens of them. Each one carefully placed, separated, protected. Some were dark with age, their markings worn but still proud. Others gleamed faintly, catching the light like they had stories waiting to be told. Clara exhaled slowly, her fingers hovering just above them, but not touching. It wasn't the value that struck her. It was the care. She closed the box gently and turned, her gaze shifting to another shelf. Medals? Framed, labeled in handwriting she knew instantly. Her grandmother's. Clara leaned closer, her breath catching as she read the small notes beneath each one. Dates, places, names she didn't recognize but somehow felt connected to. These weren't trophies. They were memories. Pieces of lives. Fragments of history, gathered, protected, remembered. Her chest tightened, and suddenly, the laughter from the will reading echoed in her mind. That old place, she almost smiled. They had no idea. None of them. Clara moved toward the center table, where a small lamp, a magnifying glass, and a pair of neatly folded gloves rested side by side. It looked as if someone had just stepped away, intending to return at any moment. Her throat tightened at the thought. Had her grandmother sat here just weeks ago? Months. Carefully examining each piece, recording it, preserving it. Alone. Clara reached for a book resting on the table. Leather-bound. Worn, but strong. She opened it slowly. And there it was. That handwriting again? Page after page. Detailed, precise, patient. Each entry describing an item, where it came from, when it was found, why it mattered. Not its price. Not its worth in dollars. Its story. Clara's eyes moved across the lines, her vision beginning to blur as something inside her shifted. This wasn't a collection. It was a lifetime. Her grandmother hadn't been gathering valuables. She had been gathering meaning. Clara swallowed hard, blinking away the sting in her eyes. And then, something deeper settled in. A realization. Heavy, but clear. This everything around her was never meant for everyone. It couldn't be. The others would have seen numbers, profit, opportunity. They would have broken it apart piece by piece, sold it, scattered it across the world until nothing remained but empty shelves and forgotten records. But her grandmother, she had known that. Of course she had. Clara let out a quiet, shaky breath. She chose me. The words barely left her lips, but they felt louder than anything she had heard all day. Not because Clara was the most successful, not because she was the strongest, but because she understood something the others didn't, or maybe because her grandmother believed she could. Clara closed the book gently, her hand lingering on its cover. For years, she had carried a quiet weight inside her, the feeling of not measuring up, of standing just outside the lives everyone else seemed to build so easily. But standing here now, that feeling began to crack, to fall away. This wasn't a leftover inheritance. This was trust. Deep, intentional, unmistakable. Clara turned slowly, letting her eyes move across the room again. But this time, she didn't see objects. She saw responsibility. Stories waiting to be protected. A legacy that could vanish in a moment if placed in the wrong hands. Her hands. She looked down at them. Steady, quiet, unremarkable to anyone else, but not to her grandmother. Clara straightened slightly, her shoulders lifting as something inside her settled into place. A decision. Not spoken, not forced. Just there. She would protect this, not because she had to, but because she wanted to, because now she understood. When she finally turned back toward the stairs, the beam of her flashlight sweeping upward, the room behind her felt different. Not hidden, not forgotten. but entrusted. And as she climbed back toward the light above, one thought stayed with her clearer than anything else. They hadn't given her the least. They had simply never seen what she had been given at all. Clara didn't rush. That was the first thing that changed. In the past, she might have felt overwhelmed, unsure of what to do next, questioning whether she even belonged in a place like this. But now, as she stood in that quiet room beneath the cabin, something steadier guided her. Patience. The same kind her grandmother had always carried. Clara set the ledger back down on the table, her fingers lingering for just a moment before she turned toward the shelves again. This time, her eyes moved more carefully, not just seeing, but searching. If this place had been built with such intention, then nothing here was random. Her flashlight drifted lower, toward a row of smaller wooden boxes tucked neatly along the bottom shelf. Unlike the others, these weren't labeled, no dates, no descriptions. Just closed. Waiting? Clara knelt slowly, brushing away a thin layer of dust from the top of one box. Her breath felt quieter now, as if the room itself was listening. She lifted the lid. Inside. Envelopes. A stack of them, tied together with a thin piece of worn twine. Her heart skipped. Carefully, she loosened the string and lifted the top envelope. Her name was written across the front. Clara Whitmore. The handwriting was unmistakable. Her grandmother's. Everything else faded. The room, the shelves, the quiet hum of the world above. All of it slipped away until there was only that envelope in her hands. For a long moment, she didn't open it. She just held it there. As if, somehow, the weight of it might change if she waited long enough. Then slowly, she slid her finger beneath the seal and unfolded the paper inside. The sound was soft, but in the silence, it felt louder than anything else. She began to read. Clara, if you are reading this, then you have found the room, and more importantly, you have taken the time to truly look. That alone tells me I made the right choice. Clara's throat tightened. She blinked, her eyes moving carefully over each line, as if afraid she might miss something important. The others would have opened a few boxes, counted what they could sell, and left the rest behind. You stayed. You always did. A tear slipped free before she could stop it. She let it fall. Everything you see here is not meant to make you rich. It is meant to remind you that value is not always measured in what something is worth, but in what it carries. Stories, lives, moments that would disappear if no one chose to remember them. Clara pressed her lips together, her hand trembling slightly now. This wasn't just a letter. It was a conversation, one she had waited years to hear. I have watched you for a long time, Clara. Not the way others do, judging what you have or haven't become, but the way you choose, the way you return what isn't yours, the way you finish what you start, even when no one is watching. Those things matter. Clara closed her eyes briefly, another tear following the first. All the years of feeling invisible, of believing she had somehow fallen short, they shifted. Just slightly, but enough. This place, and everything in it, needs someone who understands that. Not someone who wants it, someone who will protect it. Her breath caught. There is more, Clara? What you have found is only part of the story. When the time feels right, you will notice the signs I have left for you. Follow them. They will lead you to where it all began. Clara's eyes moved to the final line. I trusted you before you ever believed in yourself. Now it's time you do the same. Grandmother. The room was silent again, but it felt different now. Full. Clara lowered the letter slowly, her hands still trembling, but not from fear. From something deeper. Understanding? For so long, she had believed she was the one left with less. The forgotten one. The overlooked one. But standing here now, she saw it clearly. She hadn't been given less. She had been given more. Not just a place, not just a hidden collection, but a path, a purpose, a continuation of something that had started long before her and was now waiting for her to carry it forward. Clara folded the letter carefully, pressing it flat before placing it back in the envelope. But this time, she didn't return it to the box. She held on to it. Close, as if letting go might somehow weaken what she had just found. She stood slowly, her gaze lifting around the room once more. But now, everything looked different. Not like a discovery, but like a beginning. And somewhere, deep inside her, a quiet voice whispered something she had never truly believed before. You were chosen, not by accident, not by mistake, but for a reason, and for the first time. Clara was ready to find out what that reason was. The change didn't happen all at once. It was quieter than that. The kind of change that doesn't announce itself, but settles in, slowly, until one day you realize you're no longer the same person who walked in. For Clara, it began the moment she stepped back upstairs, the letter still in her hand. The cabin felt different now, not because anything had changed physically, the same worn floorboards, the same flicker of firelight against the walls, but because she had changed. She moved with more certainty, more awareness, as if every step she took now carried weight, purpose. She folded the letter carefully and placed it inside the drawer of the old desk, tucking it between the pages of the ledger as if anchoring it to everything her grandmother had built. Then she stood there for a moment, just looking at her own hands. Steady, no longer unsure. That evening, she worked. Not because she had to, but because she wanted to. She tightened loose boards along the porch, cleared away overgrown weeds that had begun to swallow the path leading up to the door. She oiled the hinges so the cabin no longer groaned in protest every time it was opened. Small things. But each one mattered. Each one felt like a promise. By the time the sun dipped behind the trees, the cabin didn't just feel lived in. It felt cared for. And so did she. The calls started the next morning. Clara was standing by the stove, watching the coffee slowly drip into the pot, when her phone buzzed against the wooden table. She glanced at the screen. Vivian Hale. Her aunt. Clara hesitated, then answered, Clara. Dear. Vivian's voice came through smooth, almost warm, but there was something underneath it, something practiced. I was just thinking about you out there, all alone in that old cabin. Clara didn't respond right away. She let the silence stretch. I'm fine, she said finally, calm, simple. A pause. Then, well, your grandmother had quite a few valuable things over the years. We were all surprised she didn't distribute them more fairly. There it was. Clara leaned lightly against the counter, her gaze drifting toward the rug that concealed the hatch beneath her feet. I'm sure she had her reasons, she replied. Another pause. Longer this time. Yes, I suppose she did, Vivian said, though her tone had cooled. But if you come across anything of significance, it would only be right to share it with the family. Clara's grip on the edge of the counter tightened slightly. Not out of fear, but out of clarity. There's nothing here that belongs to anyone else, she said. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't shake. It simply held. The line went quiet. Then, without another word, the call ended. More followed. A cousin, then an uncle. Each one circling the same idea, just dressed in different words. Some tried kindness. Others tried pressure. One didn't bother hiding his frustration. You really think she left all that to you for a reason? Her uncle snapped over the phone. Don't be naive, Clara. If there's money in that place, it should be divided. That's how families work. Clara listened, all the way through. Then she answered, No, she said quietly. That's how you work. And she hung up. The visits came next, unannounced. One afternoon, as Clara worked outside clearing a tangle of vines near the porch, she heard footsteps behind her. Thought you might need some help. She turned. Daniel, her cousin, dressed too clean for the forest, shoes untouched by dirt. He held a paper bag in one hand, offering it with a practiced smile. Brought you something from town. Clara accepted it, glancing inside. Cinnamon rolls. Still warm. Thank you, she said. For a moment, it almost felt genuine. Then, so, Daniel leaned casually against the porch railing, his eyes drifting toward the cabin. You've been inside a few days now. Clara didn't answer. He continued anyway. These old places, sometimes they've got hidden storage, safes, basements. You ever notice anything like that? Clara met his gaze. Steady, unmoved. I've noticed what matters, she said. His smile faltered, just slightly. Look, Clara, he sighed, dropping the act. Whatever's in there, we can figure something out. Split it, make it fair. Fair. The word lingered. Clara straightened slowly, brushing the dirt from her hands. What's fair, she said quietly, is honoring what she wanted. Daniel shook his head, frustration creeping into his voice. You're making a mistake. Clara didn't argue, didn't defend. She simply stepped back toward the door. Goodbye, Daniel. And this time, she meant it. The days that followed grew quieter. The calls slowed. The visits stopped. Not because they understood, but because they realized something had changed. Clara wasn't the same woman who had sat silently at the end of that table. She wasn't the one they could overlook, or pressure, or dismiss. She had drawn a line, and she wasn't stepping back from it. That night, Clara sat by the fire, the ledger open on her lap. The flames flickered softly, casting a warm glow across the pages. For a long moment, she didn't write. She just looked at the entries her grandmother had left behind, at the life carefully recorded in ink. Then slowly, she picked up the pen. Her hand hovered for a second, before finally, she began. Not copying, not continuing blindly, but adding her own words, her own moment. The day she found the room, the letter, the choice she had made. Each line steady, each word intentional. When she finished, she leaned back slightly, her eyes resting on what she had written. And for the first time, she didn't feel like she was standing outside of something. She felt like she belonged inside it, not as a visitor, not as an accident, but as part of the story. And as the fire crackled softly beside her, Clara Whitmore understood something her grandmother had known all along. Strength isn't loud. It doesn't need to prove itself. It simply stands and refuses to move. It happened on a quiet afternoon, the kind where the air feels still, but something beneath it is shifting. Clara was inside, standing near the window, a soft cloth in her hand as she wiped away years of dust from the glass. Outside, the trees swayed gently, their leaves catching the light in soft, golden flickers. The cabin had changed. Not dramatically, but enough. The porch stood straighter now. The path was clear. The windows let in more light. It no longer looked forgotten. It looked cared for, alive. She had just set the cloth aside when she heard it. The sound of tires on gravel. Clara didn't rush to the door. She didn't need to. She already knew who it would be. By the time she stepped outside, the car had come to a stop. 2 doors opened. Then another. Vivian. Daniel. And behind them, her uncle. They didn't speak right away. They just looked at the cabin, at the cleared yard, at Clara. There was something different in their expressions now. Not warmth. Not yet. But not dismissal either. Curiosity. Maybe even doubt. Vivian was the first to speak. Well, she said, her voice measured, eyes scanning the place. You've certainly done something with it. Clara gave a small nod. I live here now. The words landed softly, but they carried weight. Daniel shifted beside her, his gaze drifting toward the door. Mind if we take a look inside? It wasn't a question, not really. It was expectation. Clara held his gaze for a moment. Then, she stepped aside. Go ahead. They entered slowly, as if unsure what they might find. The door creaked open, but softer now, almost welcoming. Inside, the cabin held a quiet warmth. Sunlight filtered through the cleaned windows, stretching across the wooden floor. The fire in the hearth crackled gently, filling the space with a steady, comforting sound. No one spoke. Not at first. Vivian's eyes moved from the table to the chairs to the photographs above the fireplace. Daniel walked further in, his steps slower now, less certain. This place, he muttered, almost to himself. It's not what I expected. Clara remained near the door, watching, waiting. Her uncle stepped toward the center of the room, his gaze narrowing slightly as if trying to solve a puzzle that no longer made sense. "You said there was nothing here," he said, his voice quieter than before. Clara didn't answer immediately. Instead, she walked forward, past them, toward the rug. They followed her movement, their curiosity sharpening. She knelt, slowly, and for just a brief moment, she paused, not out of hesitation, but out of respect. Then she pulled the rug back. The metal ring caught the light, and just like that, everything changed. They leaned in, confusion flickering across their faces. "What is that?" Daniel asked. Clara didn't explain. She simply reached down, gripped the ring, and pulled. The hatch opened with a low, familiar creak. Darkness waited beneath. But this time, it didn't feel hidden. It felt revealed. Clara stood, stepping back slightly. "You wanted to see what was here," she said quietly. "Go ahead." Daniel went first, curiosity overpowering caution. He took the flashlight Clara handed him and began to descend. Vivian hesitated, then followed. Her uncle came last. Clara remained above, listening. The sound of footsteps on wood, then stone, then silence. A long one, the kind that stretches and stretches until it becomes something else entirely. And then a voice, soft, almost disbelieving. "This isn't possible. Another... How long has this been here?" Then nothing. Just the quiet weight of realization settling in. Minutes passed before they came back up, one by one. But they weren't the same. Daniel's face had lost its edge, replaced by something closer to awe. Vivian's posture, once sharp and composed, had softened, her eyes distant, as if still trying to process what she had seen. Her uncle didn't speak at all. He just stood there, looking at Clara, really looking at her for the first time. "You knew," he said finally. Clara shook her head gently. "No," she replied. "I just stayed long enough to find out." The words hung in the air. Simple, but undeniable. Vivian glanced back toward the hatch, then at Clara again. "We didn't understand," she admitted quietly. Clara met her gaze. "I know. No anger. No triumph. Just truth." They didn't stay long after that. There was nothing left to argue. Nothing left to take. As they walked back toward their car, the silence between them was no longer filled with judgment, but with something heavier. Regret. Clara stood on the porch, watching them leave. The sound of the engine faded, then disappeared. And just like that, it was quiet again. She stepped back inside, closing the door gently behind her. The fire still burned. Steady, unchanged. Clara walked slowly across the room, her gaze drifting once more to the rug, then to the ledger resting on the table. She picked it up, holding it close for a moment. And then, with a soft breath, she smiled. Not because she had proven anything, not because they had finally seen, but because she no longer needed them to. As she sat down by the fire, the warmth wrapping around her, one thought settled quietly into place. Some things aren't meant to be understood by everyone, only by the ones willing to stay. Long enough to see, sometimes, the most valuable things in life don't look valuable at first. Clara wasn't given the biggest inheritance, she was given the deepest one. While others saw something worthless, she chose to stay, to look closer, and that changed everything. Because in life, what you receive matters less than how you choose to see it. The people who walk away too soon miss what could have changed their lives forever. If this story meant something to you, tell me, have you ever been underestimated but proved everyone wrong? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay with us for more powerful stories like this.